So I want to talk about like how a lot of people see imperialism not as like something systemic, but as like they have like this childish notion where they think you have to take it on like a case by case basis or something. Like you need to evaluate every single imperialist action on like with like a harm reduction utilitarian framework or something. So it's like they seem to think that like the USA can have a bad intervention and a good intervention. It can do a good coup and sometimes it can do a bad coup. You got to take them all individually. You know, you can't think of it as a system or anything more. And that is incredibly childish. So many people think in that way. They think it's just like, oh, come on, you know, the US has done bad, but it's also done good or something like that. Like, they don't seem to realize that, and this doesn't just go for the US, it goes for Russia, China, any other empire that has ever existed. Like, they don't do things because they want to do good. They do things because it serves a broader purpose, a broader systemic purpose for them. So there's no such thing as the USA doing a good imperialism, doing a good intervention, doing a good coup, doing a good election rigging or something. Each and every one of those things shouldn't be happening. Ideally, they wouldn't be happening. Same goes for any other imperialist power. Russia, I wouldn't even call an imperialist power, honestly. They're more like irredentists, though that doesn't make them morally better. It's just that they're not as powerful as they would like to be. But like, you can look at like China. Now, Chinese loans, for example, are not as bad as US ones, but they're still bad. It would be better if we lived in a world where countries didn't need to take out loans from hegemonic global powers. But unfortunately, they do. So you can't be like, oh, China's giving out a good loan, because China's giving out those loans to essentially try and gain leverage over those countries, if not to eventually gain resources in their countries or whatever, at least to gain diplomatic leverage over them in the future, to like gain influence in their countries, to make them feel like they owe something to them or that they do owe something to them factually, etc. Surely they can understand that in regards to China, but most of them can't understand that in regards to the USA. So they'll be like, we need to support such and such intervention or coup or whatever of the US because this one taken on a case-by-case basis, an individual act was good or whatever. But that's not how it works. The US never does anything just because it wants to do something good on a case-by-case basis. It does these things because it wants, you know, it serves their interest in some way. It gives them more power to do what it is they really want to do on the world stage, which, as history has shown us more than enough, what they want to do is just destroy any sort of possibility of leftism taking hold anywhere in the world. Any challenge to the global capitalist system, which, by the way, they are in complete control over. That is the biggest difference between the US, China, Russia, etc. The US completely controls the global financial system. It has the number one global reserve currency. Every country in the world has to bank within the US. Countries have to bank in the US. Most corporations have to bank in the US, have to interact with US markets. You know, the US is uniquely positioned and will continue to be as the world's number one hegemonic imperialist power. And if you take a look at anything that it does, you're like, it's good on an individual basis. It's okay on a good individual basis. You know, you just look at this thing in isolation and it's good. You can't look at it in isolation. It's part of a broader system. You can't look at like the fucking, you know, the Nazi annexation of Austria and be like, well, technically most of the people in Austria wanted to join the Nazis, therefore it's okay. You know, they wanted to be part of Germany, therefore it's okay. No, that's not how it fucking works, man. Because that was a huge part of the broader Nazi goals of conquering Eastern Europe and genociding everyone who lived there and genociding all the Jews. You can't take these things in fucking isolation. You know, the US protecting Ukraine or whatever, for one, it's more than likely not going to need to, because an invasion of Ukraine isn't going to happen, as the Ukrainian president has said, or at least probably isn't going to happen. Knock on wood. I sure hope it doesn't happen. But like, that's a matter for the Ukrainians, lamentably. Or at least for the Ukrainians and, like, you know, smaller regional allies to help them in their struggle against Russian irredentism. It's not a matter for the USA on the other side of the fucking world trying to advance its geopolitical interests in a cynical fucking game against another imperial power being Russia. You can't take that on an individual basis, because it's doing that because it's going to give it more leverage, more global leverage, more global power, more influence in order to carry out what it wants to do. What does it want to do? Vietnam's, Iraq's, Afghanistan's, you know, it wants to do Chile coups, it wants to do Yemen wars, it wants to do Libya interventions. It's all part of a game. It's all part of a game in, like, not like a fucking, you know, very serious sense. It's all part of like a geopolitical game. It's all part of its broader geopolitical goals, which are essentially to do anything possible to uphold the most brutal forms of global capitalism, especially for the interests of US corporations, because they benefit the most from that, obviously due to the US's stranglehold in the global financial system. What that means, usually, as we've seen from history, it means that they want to do all the things that I just listed. They want to do those wars whenever they need to in order to protect the system, in order to protect the interests of their local capitalist class or their allies' capitalist class, to prevent any sort of possible challenge to the system, etc. US imperialism is the number one enemy of any sort of positive change in the world today. The number one enemy. It's not China, it's not Russia, imperialistic as they may be on a more limited scale. It's the US. They're the ones who are actively preventing any challenge to the global capitalist system. So when you look at what they do, and you're like, oh, on an individual level, what they did there was great. That's fine. I'm glad that happened. You should never be glad, because they shouldn't be doing any of it. All of it is part of that. And US intervention in Ukraine would not be to preserve the sanctity and self-determination of the Ukrainian people. It would be to prevent Russia from gaining influence and to gain more influence for themselves, so that maybe in the future they would have more geopolitical leverage when it comes time to invade like fucking Afghanistan again or something, and get Ukraine on their side. Weaken Russia's geopolitical bloc so that it's less capable of combating that diplomatically or directly or whatever. That's what it's about. Imperialism is a system. It goes for all imperialisms. Russian, Chinese, US. It's all a system. None of what these countries do to other countries or in other countries is good. They might be less bad than each other, but none of it is good. None of it is an imperialist. None of it should be outright supported. Like, it's one thing to say, China is less destructive than the US on the global stage. It's another to say, like, I support China. I want China to take over the world or whatever. Different things. Point is, imperialism is a system. None of it can be taken in isolation. You can't look at any act that the US does and be like, that one's good, that one's bad. That is the brain of a child. That is the brain of a little baby who is incapable of systemic analysis, who's incapable of thinking about anything on a deeper level than, Russia invade Ukraine. This bad. US defend Ukraine? This good. Booga booga. I'm Krog. That's what these people are like. I hope Ukraine, if it's invaded by Russia, which is very unlikely, manages to defend itself against their aggression. Because regardless of whatever you think about Ukraine's problems with Nazis, Russia has all those same problems. It's full of neo-Nazis too. It's full of far-righters like Putin who think that gay people don't exist and should all die or whatever, and who legalize domestic violence against women, okay? It's not exactly a great power that you want to side with. But the US also should not get involved in these disputes, what is essentially a regional irredentism, because in doing so, it's trying to advance its own imperialist aims, and we all know what those are. History has shown it. What, you lived under a fucking rock? Iraq, Afghanistan, there's your recent examples. Libya, Yemen, there's your more recent examples. It is all part of the enabling factors for that. It's all part of garnering the support, the leverage, and weakening its enemies so they can't contest that sort of thing. And that doesn't mean that when they contest that sort of thing, it's good. What you should do as a leftist is you do not support any conflict between imperialist powers. You don't take a side. Okay? You don't take a side. You don't advocate for any of it. You want them all to just not do anything. That's what you want. That's better when they do nothing. Because if they do nothing, they're not doing imperialism anymore. The world will be a much better place if all of them did nothing. Get a fucking brain, honestly. Don't be children. Think about things in terms of system, in terms of the broader picture, not just in isolation. The sort of thinking that these people engage in would legitimately lead them to be like, Saddam bad, US invasion good. That is a fact, It sounds like a straw man when people say that these people would support the Iraq war, but it is absolutely true, even if they say now that they are against it. If they were in the position that they are now during the Iraq war, they would be like, what, you think that Saddam should have WMDs? You support Saddam Hussein then? The evil dictator who gasses Kurds? They get close to their mic like this. You support Saddam Hussein, the evil dictator who gasses Kurds then? No. I'm against an obvious fucking imperialist power play. Okay? And it doesn't matter if removing Saddam Hussein would be good or not. Because that is a matter for Iraq, its people, other regional, similarly sized regional players to engage in. For example, like with what Vietnam did in Cambodia. That was not imperialism, because Vietnam cannot be argued to be an imperialist power at all. That was, a regional neighbor intervening to overthrow a government that was actively genociding Vietnamese people. And I'm glad they did it. It's not the same thing as the US going to the other side of the world and intervening to maintain the independence, as they call it, or whatever, of another country, or maintain democracy or whatever. It's all bullshit. And in regards to Iraq, Saddam was bad, absolutely, but he shouldn't have been overthrown by a fucking US invasion. There's a difference between interventions as a part of like an imperialist powers, imperialist system, and like a random isolated intervention by like regional neighbors or whatever. Or even like something like Cuba intervening in Africa, for example. You can't say that Cuba did imperialism. Imperialism is not when you intervene in another country. Imperialism is when you have like massive global financial power and diplomatic leverage and such, like the US does, and throw that around to impose your will on other nations. Cuba was just intervening on the part of one side in the civil war as a tiny little island nation. It's not even remotely the same thing. They have no sort of international financial power. There's no such thing as Cuban imperialism because there's no Cuban systemic imperialism. So look, imperialism is systemic. It's not something that you can take on an individual basis. Everything that imperialist countries do is done in order to further their own imperialist aims, which each and every single one of them serves to maintain the global capitalist system. Whether we're talking about China, Russia, or the USA, that's what it's all for. Though the USA more than the others because it's far more invested in the global capitalist system. It is the global capitalist system. Its country controls it all. When you're like, oh, we need to look at, these Chinese loans to like an African country, they forgave the debt. That's good. That's great. Well, you can understand why the African country took the loan because the other option is the fucking IMF. But it's not good. It's not good that China is like using throwing around like financial way to try and gain leverage over countries in Africa. Try and like make them owe something to China. Try and bring them into its global geopolitical bloc to serve its imperialism. That's not good. These people can acknowledge that, but they can't acknowledge the same when it comes to the USA. It's not good that the USA wants to send troops to Ukraine. It's not good that the USA wants to intervene in Ukraine. It's much worse, in fact, that they want to do that because this is part of a much bigger and broader system of imperialism. It's not isolated action that you can judge in isolation based on harm reduction or your utilitarian moral framework or whatever dumb shit these people appeal to. They want African resources and markets. That's literally what imperialism is. It's not a deal. It's one side with far more power and leverage coercing another. That's what imperialism is. There's no deal here. There's no equal parties to these deals. It's one side that's strangled by global capitalism, that's forced into siding with an imperial power to be able to even exploit its own natural resources, do primary production. That's not good. That's imperialism. Voluntarily doesn't mean shit. Governments voluntarily enter into agreements with the USA to build military bases in their countries. That's not what voluntary is. They're obviously taken under coercion. So we're talking about fucking systems here. It's coercive. It's like, we want to build a military base in your country, and usually like the government there will be one that is biased towards the US, that they have through the global capitalist system exerted influence to get that government there in the first place. And then it's also coercive in the way that there's like a unspoken or even perhaps spoken behind the scenes understanding that it's like, you need to give us this or, we're not going to treat you as well. We're not going to help you out as much. That's imperialism. It's imperialism when China does it. It's imperialism when the US does it. Even if the US is far harsher, far more direct to its imperialism, they're all still imperialisms. At the end of the day, it's all Western chauvinism. People are going to ignore what I've said here. They're going to be like, no, I support the USA because it does good intervention sometimes. What's what? You support Russian irredentism, dude? My dude, you don't support the US sending troops to Ukraine to uphold its global system of imperialism and try to start World War III? No, my dude. It's because they're racist. They're just fundamentally American nationalists who support anything that it does, even though they try to play it off as if they don't, in a post hoc fashion. They would support the Iraq War if it happened today in the exact same fashion they would have supported it. That's just a fact, because that's how they think. Fundamentally, most of the people who, at least in online political spheres, who claim to be leftists and are in the West are massive shills for Western imperialism. That's why they spread this narrative of what I just went over, basically. That's like, we need an intervention or whatever. And, this intervention is good in isolation because they genuinely believe that the problem with US imperialism is that it sometimes does bad things and that it should just do good things. It should just do good imperialism all the time. They have no sort of systemic analysis of what the US actually wants and why it does the things that it does. Honestly, they probably do. They just support it. They want the US to be the hegemon. They want the US to completely financially and militarily dominate the entire world. They want capitalism to be maintained forever until the world becomes a fucking lava covered Hulk. Everything that I said here is going to go in one ear and out the other, but it needed to be said anyway. There you go.